The rain had been falling since dawn, thin, relentless, and cold as judgment. It turned the dust of Willow Creek into a gray slurry that clung to boots and hems, swallowing what little dignity the poor still tried to preserve. The townsfolk gathered despite the weather, drawn by curiosity more than cruelty, though cruelty was what they carried in their eyes. They stood beneath the warped awning of the old courthouse, faces half hidden beneath dripping hats, as the sheriff mounted the wooden platform and struck his gavel against the post. "Next item," he called, voice hoarse with disinterest, "the property of the late Mr. Holling." It was not land he meant. It was not livestock. It was her. She stepped forward, slow, hesitant, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders where the rain had soaked through to her skin. The woman's face was pale beneath the brim of her bonnet, her eyes lowered but burning with the terrible effort of restraint. In her arms a small boy, perhaps 2 years old, buried his face against her neck, clutching the fabric of her dress with desperate fingers. The crowd stirred. Someone spat into the mud. A man in a stained coat muttered something about fools' debts and gamblers' widows. A woman with a basket clucked her, tongue as though pity were a sin she couldn't afford. The sheriff adjusted his spectacles. "This here widow owes the town $280 in unpaid debts, including funeral costs and the estate sale fees. As decreed by the magistrate, she and her child are to be indentured until the debt is repaid." The word indentured rolled from his mouth like something official, something clean, but everyone knew what it meant. It was an auction. The woman stood very still. Her breath trembled once, and she bit her lip to keep it quiet. She did not plead. She had begged enough in the weeks since her husband's death, at the store, at the boarding house, at the church steps, where even the reverend could only sigh and shake his head. There was nothing left to ask for. A man stepped forward, the first bidder. He was a cattle rancher, thick-necked and ruddy, known for drinking and for the women who came and went from his homestead like passing storms. "I'll take her," he said, his tone casual. 2 months' service for the debt." A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd. The sheriff lifted a brow. "2 months won't cover 280, Mr. Grady. Then make it 6. His grin widened. "I'll find use for her, and the boy can muck the stalls," the child whimpered, as though he understood. Before the sheriff could answer, another voice broke through the rain, quiet, refined and cutting. 6 months, it said, is far too generous a term for cruelty. The crowd turned. He stood a few paces away, tall beneath the brim of a dark hat, the collar of his wool coat turned up against the weather. The stranger's presence altered the air itself. Conversation ceased, as though the storm had suddenly paused to listen. His face was difficult to read, handsome in a severe, distant way, the kind of face that carried more memory than expression. The sheriff blinked. "You are?" The man removed a small card from his coat pocket, glancing at it as though reminding himself of his own name before replying. "Duke Alistair Harrow," a whisper rippled through the crowd. "A duke?" It was an old title from England, foreign here, absurd almost, but his bearing made it believable. He had the composure of one who had been obeyed all his life, though he seemed weary of the fact. The sheriff cleared his throat. "You wish to make a bid, sir?" "I do." His gaze turned to the woman, not with hunger nor pity, but something steadier, recognition perhaps, though they had never met. "I will assume the full debt." A stunned silence followed. The rancher laughed. "You'll pay $280 for a widow and her brat? Hell, you could buy 3 strong hands for less." The Duke did not turn to him. "Then you undervalue hands, sir, and overestimate your worth." A few men chuckled uneasily this time. The rain thickened. The sheriff hesitated. "The law permits redemption if the debt is satisfied in full. Is that your intent?" "It is," the Duke said simply. He drew from his coat a folded envelope, sealed with wax, and handed it to the sheriff. Inside, crisp notes and a bank draft, more than the sum owed. The sheriff counted twice, then nodded. Debt cleared. "Widow Holling, you are free." The words fell heavy. The woman did not move, as though afraid the sound might vanish if she breathed. The Duke turned toward her, speaking softly enough that only those nearest heard. "You need not thank me," he said. "It is not charity. It is decency." Her lips parted, but no sound came. The rancher muttered something under his breath and stalked away, his boots sinking in the mire. The others followed in slow dispersal, their curiosity dulled by the anticlimax of goodness. Only the rain remained, falling without pause, filling the ruts of the street until the reflection of the gaslight trembled like flame on water. The Duke removed his coat and draped it over the woman's shoulders. "You'll catch your death," he murmured. "There's warmth at my carriage. Come." She hesitated, clutching her child closer. "I cannot repay—" "You will not," he interrupted, his tone firm but gentle. "No one should owe their life to mercy." Something in his voice broke the last of her pride. She allowed herself to be guided down from the platform, her boots sinking into the mud. The crowd had thinned to shadows. Only a few eyes watched from beneath dripping awnings, whispering as she passed. They reached the carriage, a black figure gleaming faintly through the mist. The driver tipped his hat. The door opened. The Duke gestured for her to enter first. She hesitated once more at the threshold, then turned to him. "Why?" she asked quietly. "You don't even know my name." He regarded her for a moment, the rain tracing silver lines across his face. "Names are luxuries," he said. "I've learned character speaks before they do." The words lingered between them, more intimate than they were meant to be. Inside the carriage, the air was warm, scented faintly of tobacco and leather. The woman sat with her child against her chest, the shawl damp, her heart too heavy to trust the calm. The Duke took the seat opposite, his gloved hands resting on his cane, his eyes fixed not on her, but on the gray horizon beyond the window. The wheels began to turn. For a long time, nothing was said. Only the rhythm of rain against glass filled the silence, steady, mournful, almost tender. The widow closed her eyes, exhaustion overtaking fear. The child slept. Outside, the town of Willow Creek faded into mist. The narrator, if one could name the voice that sees all, might have spoken then, softly to the unseen listener. There are moments when the world bargains for a soul and does not know its worth. That morning, among the mud and the shame and the rain, decency bought itself a second chance. And the cost was yet to be reckoned. The carriage rolled onward, carrying its unlikely passengers toward the vast unknown, where debt might be repaid in something gentler than coin. The journey to the Duke's estate took the better part of 2 days, though the widow scarcely recalled any of it. The roads were long and winding, stretching through valleys of pale grass and skeletal trees, until even the horizon seemed to lose color. She had slept only in moments, half waking to the sound of the wheels striking stones and the faint murmur of the Duke's voice, giving quiet instructions to the driver. When at last the carriage halted, dawn was breaking, a pale gold light filtering through the morning fog, and before her stood a mansion that looked less like a home than a monument to solitude. It rose from the earth like a shadowed fortress, all dark stone and shuttered windows framed by bare oaks and the distant gleam of a lake. There was beauty in it, yes, but it was a beauty of restraint, of discipline, not warmth. The woman stepped out with her child clinging to her skirts, the Duke offering his gloved hand as though it were the most natural thing in the world to guide a stranger across his threshold. Inside, the house was silent save for the muted echo of their footsteps across the marble floor. A tall woman, his housekeeper, gray-haired and severe, appeared to greet them with a curtsy. Her eyes flicked over the widow and the child, then to the Duke, her expression unreadable. "Your Grace," she murmured, "we weren't expecting company." "I expect little and inform less," the Duke replied, removing his coat. "Mrs. Holling and her son will stay in the east wing. Prepare the rooms near the nursery." The housekeeper hesitated. "Sir, those rooms haven't been opened in years." "Then see that they are," he said, his tone leaving no room for question. When the housekeeper departed, the widow spoke for the first time since their arrival. "You needn't go to such trouble. We can take whatever corner you deem fit. We won't stay long." The Duke regarded her with quiet curiosity. "You misunderstand, madam. You are to stay as long as you require. My home has space enough for silence, and 2 souls in need of rest will not burden it." He turned away before she could answer, leaving her to follow the housekeeper down long corridors lined with portraits. Every face on those walls seemed to watch her, somber and pale, like memories that refused to die. The room prepared for her was modest compared to the grandeur of the estate, but held an unfamiliar comfort: a lit hearth, a fresh quilt, and a small cradle beside the window. The boy clambered onto the bed, his laughter startling the stillness. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe. That evening she was invited, summoned, more accurately, to dine with the Duke. She entered the great hall uncertainly, dressed in a borrowed gown that hung loosely at the shoulders. The table stretched nearly the length of the room, yet only 2 places were set. The Duke rose as she entered, a gesture of courtesy that felt almost foreign in a world that had long ceased to be kind. "I hope the accommodations are tolerable," he said. "They're more than I deserve," she replied softly. He studied her a moment before sitting. Deserve is a word the selfless use too often against themselves. They dined mostly in silence. The food was simple, the atmosphere heavier than the storm clouds outside. Between courses, thunder rolled across the hills, the sound reverberating through the old stone walls. The Duke seemed accustomed to such weather. He ate with quiet precision, his expression betraying nothing. Finally he asked, "Do you plan to return to Willow Creek?" Her fork trembled against the plate. "There's nothing left there for me. My husband's debts are cleared, but the shame remains." He nodded, as if he had expected no other answer. Shame is a currency society spends freely, especially upon those least able to afford it. The conversation ended there. Yet, as she looked across the table at the man who had purchased her freedom, she found no arrogance in him, only weariness. The kind of weariness that comes not from age, but from too many years of solitude. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the house began to shift. Servants whispered behind closed doors, glancing toward the east wing whenever the Duke passed. Word spread through the nearby town that the reclusive Duke had brought home a widow and her child, and though no one dared to confront him, speculation grew like weeds. One afternoon, while tending to the boy near the garden, the widow overheard 2 maids gossiping. "They say she was bought at auction," one whispered. "Imagine His Grace rescuing such a woman. What will his peers think?" The other giggled. "Perhaps he means to make her his mistress." Lonely men grow generous when they're haunted. The widow's face burned, but she said nothing. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Yet that evening, as she sat near the fire, the Duke entered the room unannounced. He carried a small book in his hand, though it seemed less for reading than as an excuse to approach. "I hear the staff have been unkind," he said, his tone quiet but edged with steel. She looked up sharply. "You hear much, Your Grace." "Enough to know injustice when it echoes in my own halls." He paused. "Shall I dismiss them?" "No." Her reply was firm, surprising even herself. "They speak what others think. It would be unfair to punish honesty, however cruelly it's voiced." His eyes softened. "You are merciful even when wronged. That is rare." The silence between them lengthened, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Finally he said almost to himself, "This house was built to endure storms, yet of all its tempests, none have unsettled it more than your presence." She did not know what to answer, and he did not wait for one. He left as quietly as he had come, but the air he left behind was charged with something unspoken, something that neither of them yet dared name. The following morning, a letter arrived from the Duke's sister in Charleston, inviting him to a gathering of his peers. She wrote of whispers already spreading about his new charity case, urging him to correct appearances before the family's reputation is sullied. He folded the letter without a word and tossed it into the fire. The paper curled, blackened, and was gone. That night the widow stood at her window, the child asleep beside her, watching the moonlight spill across the lake. She could not sleep. Gratitude warred with guilt. Comfort fought the fear of dependency. She thought of the Duke, of his silence, his distance, his strange kindness, and wondered what he truly sought from her presence. Down the hall the Duke sat alone in his study, a glass untouched before him. The rain had begun again, tapping softly against the panes. He looked toward the east wing, where the light from her room flickered faintly and whispered into the emptiness. Some debts cannot be paid in coin, nor forgotten in peace. Outside, thunder rolled once more, and the great house seemed to hold its breath, as if it, too, waited to see which would come first, redemption or ruin. Spring came late to the valley that year, as though the earth itself hesitated to wake. The snow melted slow and uncertain, leaving the meadows soaked and silvered with dew. By the time the first crocuses bloomed along the garden paths of the Duke's estate, the widow had been there for nearly a month. She had learned the rhythm of the house, the way footsteps carried through marble halls, the hours when the Duke disappeared into his study, the soft ring of the bell that called for supper. What she had not learned was the rhythm of his heart. He remained courteous, distant, and impossibly composed. At breakfast he would inquire after her comfort with the politeness of a host, then vanish into his duties. At supper he listened more than he spoke, his gaze drifting to the window where the child played in the fading light. Only once had he raised his voice, when a visiting tradesman made an unkind remark about the Duke's charity. His words had been few, but the tradesman left pale, bowing his apologies. The insult scorched from his tongue. After that day, the household spoke the widow's name with caution. The garden became her refuge. In its wild, unkempt beauty, she found the peace the house denied her. The air there smelled of damp earth and lilac, and the old gazebo by the lake offered shade enough for thought. It was there one soft afternoon that the Duke found her kneeling among the flower beds, her hands dark with soil, her son chasing a butterfly through the tall grass. "You favor hard work over leisure, Mrs. Holling," he said. His tone was light, but his presence still carried weight, like the sudden hush before a sermon. She brushed her hands against her apron and rose. The flowers were choking on weeds. "I thought they might breathe better if I helped," he smiled faintly. "You sound like someone who has spent too long suffocating in others' neglect." She looked away, uncomfortable, beneath the gentleness of his observation. "I am no lady of refinement, Your Grace. Work is all I know." "Then it is work that has kept you human," he replied. "Idleness robs a soul faster than hunger." The child ran past them, laughing, a streak of sunlight in his hair. The Duke's gaze followed him, softening. "He looks stronger," he murmured. "He sleeps without fear now," she said, her voice quieter. "I had forgotten how peaceful a child's breath can sound when there is no knocking at the door." He said nothing, but something in his face, an echo of understanding, told her he knew that sound too well. A breeze stirred through the trees, carrying the scent of rain. Clouds gathered on the horizon. "Come," the Duke said, extending a hand. "The storm will break soon." They reached the gazebo just as the first drops began to fall, slow, deliberate, like the start of a confession. The child curled against his mother's lap, half asleep, while she watched the rain blur the world beyond the garden. The Duke stood near the entrance, his posture as rigid as the columns that framed them. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" she said at last. "Of course. Why did you do it?" Her voice trembled despite herself. "That day in Willow Creek, you could have turned away, like all the others." Men of standing do not involve themselves in the ruin of women like me. His answer came slow, each word chosen as though it might wound. "Because I have seen what ruin does when left to fester. I once watched a good woman destroyed by the apathy of those who might have helped her. I swore I would not stand idle again." "You speak of your wife," she said softly. His eyes met hers then, gray and unguarded, like the sea before a storm. "Yes, though I fear I was the instrument of her misery, not its cure." The rain thickened. She waited, knowing silence was sometimes the only kindness one could offer. He continued, quieter. "She married me for title, I for duty. I did not love her, nor she me. Yet society called it a union of fortune and honor. She lived in this house 3 years and never smiled. When illness came, I felt relief instead of grief. Well, that was my sin," her breath caught. "You blame yourself for not feeling what could not be forced, perhaps. But duty without affection is a prison, Mrs. Holling, and I have been its willing warden ever since." The widow traced the edge of the bench with her fingers. "Then you built these walls as penance," he gave a quiet laugh without joy, "and you rid them better than I ever have." Lightning flashed, followed by the low growl of thunder. The child stirred but did not wake. She spoke then, her voice raw. "My husband gambled away everything we owned. When he died, the town turned their scorn on me as though I'd thrown the dice myself. I begged for work, food, mercy. None came. When they put me on that block, I thought God had turned his back. But you stood there, you, of all men." He looked at her, rain dripping from his hair, his gloves resting forgotten beside him. "You believe I was sent by God." "I believe," she said, "that grace sometimes wears the face of a stranger." The silence between them was thick as the storm. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jaw, the weariness etched at the corner of his eyes. "You give me too much credit," he said softly. "I am not a savior. I am a man who saw suffering and could not look away." "And yet," she whispered, "you did look away. From yourself." His breath caught. For a moment neither moved. The world around them seemed suspended in the sound of rain striking the roof, in the small heartbeat of a child sleeping between them. Then he reached out, hesitant, as if afraid she might dissolve beneath his touch. His hand brushed hers, light, fleeting, but charged with all the words they could not say. "Had we met in another time," he murmured, "before life taught us to fear kindness, perhaps I might have—" "Don't," she interrupted, though her own voice broke. "Do not finish what cannot be begun." He withdrew his hand, his composure returning like armor. Yet his eyes betrayed him, quietly, fiercely alive. Outside the rain began to fade, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet lilac and earth. The Duke turned to leave, pausing at the threshold of the gazebo. "You've restored more than the garden today," he said. "You've reminded a man that even broken soil can bloom again." When he was gone, the widow sat for a long while, her son's head resting against her knee, her pulse echoing the rhythm of receding thunder. She did not cry. She had forgotten how. But as she looked toward the house, its windows glimmering faintly through the mist, she understood that something fragile and forbidden had taken root. The narrator might have called it mercy or fate, or the quiet rebellion of two hearts too scarred to name their longing. Whatever it was, it had begun with rain and would not end without it. The announcement of the Duke's spring ball rippled through the valley like a spark through dry grass. It had been years since he had opened his house to the world, years of solitude, of shutters drawn and invitations declined. Yet this season, without warning, he sent for musicians, carriages of wine and silk from New Orleans. The town whispered its reasons, a political ambition, a reconciliation, perhaps even madness. But beneath the chandeliers of the great hall the truth waited, fragile, forbidden, and unnamed. The widow watched from the staircase as servants hung garlands of pale roses along the rail. Her borrowed gown, a modest ivory dress the housekeeper had altered for her, felt like an impostor's disguise. She had begged to remain unseen that night, to keep to her quarters, but the Duke had refused her plea with quiet finality. "You have hidden long enough," he said. "Let them see who stands under my roof without shame." Now, as the orchestra tuned their violins, she felt the weight of every whisper. Guests began to arrive, women shimmering in lace, men gleaming in polished boots, the scent of perfume and cigars mingling with candle smoke. Their laughter filled the air, brittle and rehearsed. When the Duke entered, the noise dulled to reverent murmurs. He was dressed in black, severe and regal, yet his eyes softened when they found her across the room. He offered his arm, and though her hands trembled, she took it. The crowd parted as they walked. Two figures that did not belong yet somehow commanded the space. Conversation hushed, and the murmurs began again, this time sharper, deliberate. "Is that her? The woman from the auction? She's ruined. He'll tire of his charity soon enough." The widow lowered her gaze, but the Duke's hand tightened around hers, anchoring her. "Do not bow to them," he murmured. "They are weaker than their own envy." They reached the center of the hall as the music began. The first waltz unfurled, a slow, aching melody that filled every corner of the room. She hesitated, but he bowed slightly, offering his hand. "Dance with me," he said. and something in his tone left no room for refusal. Their movements were hesitant at first, the widow's steps uncertain beneath the scrutiny of 100 eyes. Yet, as the Duke guided her, the world seemed to narrow to the rhythm of strings and the warmth of his palm against hers. The crowd's whispers grew distant, replaced by the sound of her own heartbeat. For a moment it was almost peace. Then, as the music waned, a voice, thin, sharp, unmistakably cruel, cut through the hall. "Your Grace," it drawled, "you do your guests a disservice parading your acquisition in place of a lady." The laughter that followed was small, poisonous. The widow froze, her breath catching. The Duke's jaw hardened, but he did not turn. "I beg your pardon," he said, his voice calm but edged with danger. The speaker stepped forward, a colonel's son, a man bred in privilege and arrogance. "No pardon required, sir, only honesty. We have all heard the tale. You bought her from the gallows of poverty. Call it what it is, a transaction. Even nobility cannot purchase respect with coin." Gasps rippled through the hall. The widow's vision blurred. Humiliation burned in her chest. She made to retreat, but the Duke caught her hand before she could flee. "Enough," he said, his voice low but carrying. "You mistake silence for submission, sir." He turned then, addressing the crowd at large, his tone sharpening into steel. "Yes, I purchased her freedom. I found her in a place where men like you stood idly by while decency was auctioned for amusement. I paid what others would not, to restore what your cruelty had taken." The room went still. Candlelight flickered against the marble, against faces caught between awe and discomfort. The Duke's gaze swept over them, commanding. "You call her ruined? Then ruin must be a finer thing than virtue, for she has borne more suffering with grace than any among you could endure with pride. You speak of scandal, yet I tell you this, the only scandal here is the cowardice that dares mock compassion." He turned toward her then, and in his eyes was no restraint, no fear of consequence. "Let the world know my truth," he said, his voice breaking through the silence like a blade through glass. "This woman is not my burden, she is my salvation. I love her." The words fell like thunder. The orchestra stilled. A lady's fan snapped in two, the widow's knees weakened. Her breath came shallow, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. "Your Grace," she whispered, "you cannot—" "I can," he said, "and I will. They may call it folly, they may call it ruin. But I have lived too long behind walls built by pride. Let them crumble." The colonel's son sputtered, his arrogance deflating. "You would disgrace your name for her?" "For once," the Duke replied, "I would honor it." He turned to the widow, extending his hand once more, not as a savior this time, but as an equal. "If you still doubt your worth, take my hand and see how little the world's approval weighs against the truth of a heart unashamed." The hall held its breath. She stood there trembling, her child's face flashing in her mind, the fear, the hunger, the countless nights alone. And then she saw what she had not dared to before, that this man, too, was starved for forgiveness, for love, for the courage to defy the chains of his birthright. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. The crowd erupted, some in gasps, others in scandalized whispers, but the Duke heard none of it. He drew her close, not as a gesture of defiance, but as one of peace. The music resumed hesitantly, as though the orchestra itself were uncertain what melody could follow such confession. Outside, thunder rolled again, distant and low, echoing the pulse that now bound two hearts in a single. Reckless rhythm. The narrator might have said then, in a world governed by propriety, it was not sin that brought ruin, but honesty. And that night, within the Duke's house of judgment, truth danced uninvited, and would not be silenced again. As the final note trembled through the hall, the widow lifted her eyes to meet his. Whatever came next, scorn, exile, redemption, it would be theirs together, and somewhere in the corner, unnoticed, the old chandelier swayed above them, scattering its fractured light like blessings disguised as broken things. Years passed, as years often do, not loudly, but with the quiet certainty of dusk swallowing daylight. The Duke's estate, once a fortress of silence, had changed its voice. Where solemn halls had once echoed with loneliness, laughter now lingered like a familiar hymn. Roses bloomed where neglect had ruled, and the scent of lilac drifted through open windows. Yet even beauty, hard-won and enduring, could not escape the shadows of time. It was a late summer evening when the widow, no longer a guest, but a duchess by law and love, walked through the garden that had once been her refuge. The air shimmered with gold dust, the sun bending low across the lake. Her son, now nearly grown, practiced his aim with a rifle under the old oak, his laughter bright and unrestrained. She smiled, though the sound pulled at a tenderness that never quite faded. The Duke watched from the veranda, a glass of brandy untouched beside him. His hair had turned silver at the temples, but his eyes remained steady, the same gray that had once silenced a jeering crowd. When she reached him, he rose, taking her hand as though the gesture were still new. "He grows bold," he said, nodding toward the boy. "Reminds me too much of myself at that age. Too sure, too ready to challenge the world before understanding its weight." She smiled faintly. "And yet you let him test his strength." "You always did." "I have no wish to dull his fire," the Duke replied, "only to teach him that flame must be tempered, or it devours what it means to warm." They stood together for a moment, watching the boy reload with clumsy precision. The Duke's hand rested lightly over hers, his thumb tracing the edge of her wedding band, a modest gold ring that meant more to him than the ancestral jewels locked away upstairs. "I sometimes think," she said softly, "that fate was cruel to give us love so late. We might have had years to waste together." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Cruelty gave us time enough to earn it." It was the kind of answer only he could give, measured, restrained, and unbearably true. Inside, the housekeeper announced the arrival of a letter. The Duke took it with a nod, breaking the seal as they returned indoors. The handwriting was familiar, his sister's, elegant and cold. He read in silence, his expression darkening. "She invites us to London," he said finally, folding the letter with deliberate care. "A family gathering. She writes of reconciliation, though her tone carries less forgiveness than scrutiny." The Duchess hesitated. "Will you go?" He met her gaze. "Not without you. She will not receive me kindly." "Then let her choke on her decorum," he said, his voice low but firm. "I spent half a lifetime honoring a world that feeds upon hypocrisy. I will not kneel to it again." She reached for his arm. "And if they shun you for it?" He smiled faintly. "They already have. But if exile means peace beside you, I will bear it gladly." That night, when the house had quieted and the lamps burned low, the Duke sat at his piano, a relic long untouched. His fingers traced the keys, coaxing hesitant notes into the air. The melody was uneven, fragile, but the Duchess recognized it. It was the same waltz they had danced to that scandalous night when love had defied every whisper. She approached from behind, resting her hand upon his shoulder. "You remember it still. Some moments," he murmured. "One does not forget even when memory fades." The music faltered. His hand paused mid-key. She saw it then, the tremor he'd been hiding for weeks, the fatigue in his posture, the color drained from his face. "How long?" she whispered. He did not lie. "The physician suspects the heart. He says rest may delay it, but not undo what's begun." Her hand tightened. "You should have told me." He turned to her, his eyes soft but unyielding. "What would you have done? Watched me with pity? Counted my breaths as I once counted yours?" "Loved you harder," she said fiercely. "As I will now," he smiled, the rare kind that reached his eyes. "Then let that be my cure." The days that followed were gentle, suspended between joy and fear. He took to the garden each morning, reading beneath the gazebo where they had once confessed their broken hearts. The Duchess would sit beside him, mending, humming, or simply watching the light shift across his face. Some days he seemed himself, steady, commanding, amused by her quiet stubbornness. Others he grew pale and withdrawn, his strength ebbing like the tide. On the final evening of summer, as the sky turned to rose and amber, he asked to walk once more to the lake. She helped him there, her arm steady beneath his. They stood at the water's edge, the reflection of the setting sun trembling across its surface. "Do you remember," he said softly, "the rain that night, the first one?" "I remember every drop," she replied. He nodded faintly. "I thought I was saving you." "But it was you who saved me, from silence, from pride. from the man I had become. She pressed her forehead to his chest. You speak as though we are ending. No, he whispered, as though we have finally begun. The wind stirred through the reeds, carrying the faint scent of lilac. His hand slipped from hers, resting against the bench beside them. She felt it even before she saw it, the stillness that followed, deep and absolute. She did not cry, not then. She sat beside him as the last light faded, her hand folded in his cooling one, her face lifted toward the darkening sky. When the boy came running through the garden at dusk, he found her there, silent, composed, her expression both shattered and serene. They buried him beneath the oak near the lake. The town came in quiet reverence, no longer whispering scandal, but revering legend. The Duke who had defied society for love was gone, but his defiance had outlived him. Years later, the Duchess would walk that same path alone, her son now a man grown, the estate alive with new laughter. She would pause by the water, touching the stone that bore only his name and the words she had chosen. He paid no debt but love, and left no fortune but mercy. And though the world beyond had long forgotten the scandal, within those garden walls his voice still lingered in the rustle of leaves. His promise carried in the sigh of every passing breeze, for love, once mocked and bought with shame, had conquered its final silence and bloomed eternal.